So what happens when you never ever check the oil level on your mower? Well, what sometimes happens is that you break the engine, and in this case, the connecting rod. That pretty much meant that this $470 mower is nothing more than a pile of junk and ready to be put on the curb for someone else to deal with. Fortunately, the poor soul that picked it up was me. Now it's my turn to figure out what to do with it, fix it or sell the parts. Hopefully by the end of the video, I won't be regretting my decision. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Craftsman branded lawnmower, and the problem is that this engine was apparently ran low on oil and the connecting rod ended up breaking, and now I have to figure out if it's worth fixing or if I need to sell it and maybe even recycle it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this mower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, in the last video on this mower, we were trying to figure out if it was even broken or not, and after a few minutes of testing, it was very apparent that the piston was not moving despite rotating the blade. After draining all the fluids and removing the engine from the mowing deck, we were finally able to remove the oil sump and take a look inside the engine. What we found was a jigsaw puzzle of broken pieces, but after looking at the other visible parts, things started to look worse, if that was even possible. By the end of the teardown, things looked pretty bad. After gathering all the pieces I could find, the only part that seemed to be broken was the connecting rod, but when something like this happens, there's bound to be other parts that are going to be damaged by it. That meant we needed to take out the other parts and see just how bad it really was, and man was I surprised by what all got taken out by a broken rod. After getting the head off the engine, I was able to get the piston out, and that's when things went from bad to worse. It turns out the piston was able to make contact with the spinning crankshaft, and that took quite a bit of material off the piston near the wrist pin. That means this repair went from cheap to expensive real quick. So here's my dilemma. It's all about parts cost versus value and even the cost of a brand new engine. So as of right now, this is the parts list of the things I would like to get. The first part is a brand new connecting rod, which is $21 from my favorite website to order from, followed by the piston, which is priced at a high $52. The other part that was lightly damaged was the camshaft. A new replacement is priced at only $20. I'm also going to need a new head gasket and a sump gasket. The head gasket is priced at $13 and the sump gasket comes in at only $12. So that means the grand total for all the parts I would like to buy is a whopping $118, and that's before taxes. After taxes, it would be well over $130. There's just one major problem. For double the cost of the parts I just mentioned, I could buy a completely new engine. So that means for about $230, I can pick up a brand new 163cc Briggs engine and simply take it out of the box and install it onto the mowing deck. I won't have to worry about metal on the journal, scored cylinder walls, connecting rod torque specs, and sealing gaskets. It's so tempting to just order a brand new engine, but yet again, I have another dilemma. What's the value of this mower in running condition? How much would you pay to buy this mower? $250? $225? I seriously doubt you're going to pay more than $300 for it, right? Even though I got this mower for absolutely free, if I paid $230 plus taxes for a brand new engine, I'd have to sell it for over $300 to make any money on it. So buying a new engine is out of the question. And even though buying the new parts would mean I would make some money if I sold it, it simply isn't enough to bother even trying. Or is there yet another way to maximize my profit? I can already hear people yelling at the screen, but you're absolutely right. I should buy used parts instead. Of course, they have to be in good condition, and if they work, I could save a lot of money on parts. So on the advice of my accountant, I decided to buy used parts, and the reasoning is simple. This is not a new engine, it's a used one, so it's getting used parts. Now since I needed a piston and connecting rod, I decided to buy a set, and after looking at this one, it certainly looks better than the one that came out of this engine, so I'm happy with its condition. So how much money did I save going this route? Well, instead of paying $73 for a new piston and rod, I paid a mere $25 for this one. So what about the other two parts then? Well, for the head gasket, I'm going to do something that a lot of people are not going to like, and that is I'm going to reuse the old one along with the copper spray on top of it. So is that the best idea? Probably not, but it's going to work, and that's good enough for me. The first thing I need to do is to clean any oil and dirt off the old gasket and then let it dry really well before I spray on the copper. So I know this is not what most people would probably do, but to be honest, it's what I want to do. Of course, if the gasket was damaged, I'd replace it, but this one was in really good condition. After that, I'm going to clean all the metal debris out of the sump and the block using stale gasoline. To be quite honest, this is probably not the best idea either, but what are you going to do with 2-year-old gasoline anyway? The other reason you probably don't want to do this is because of future health issues, but it is your choice, so make it a good one. While I'm cleaning out the debris, I'm also going to clean off the old gasket in preparation for the next step, which is yet again something most are not going to agree with. Now, I'm not sure how the used rod and piston were stored, so I'm going to give them a good bath just to make sure they don't have any extra metal or anything else that might be on them I don't want in the engine. Yes, I could have sprayed it down with brake cleaner from the beginning, but I could have easily used a good portion of a can, and that stuff isn't cheap either. The gasoline was free, however, which I got from an old generator project. I'm not sure if you're seeing a pattern to my thinking here, but if you haven't figured it out, let me spell it out for you. I'm going to fix this used engine in the most economical way possible, and that's because money isn't getting any easier to come by. So I've been told that the cylinder walls might be coated, and if it is, well, I guess we'll find out soon enough. But to give the piston rings the best chance to seal the combustion chamber, I'm going to hone the cylinder for about 30 seconds. Now, to find out if this was a bad idea, I'm going to perform multiple compression tests after I get the engine running and see if the numbers keep dropping. I'm pretty sure I didn't need to do this, but I figured I'd give it a shot anyway. After I'm done using the hone, I'll spray some brake cleaner into the cylinder, and hopefully I didn't just ruin it. Now, I didn't get rid of most of the major scratches, but it's better than doing nothing, I guess. After that, I'm going to clean the deck of any old gasket coating, and then I'll start to clean out the block using brake cleaner. Now, I could have used some of that old gasoline here as well, but it's a bit more difficult to use in this area versus a spray can. After that, I'm going to try and clean the carbon off the cylinder head. Now, this wasn't as successful as I was hoping would be, but it did get the majority of it. Once that's done, I think it's finally time to reassemble the engine. I know I'm going a bit fast here, but this process took a lot longer than I was expecting, and even though I'm not skipping anything I did, I am trying not to make this process take any longer than it needs to. While I was trying to install the piston, I really had to fight with the rings. Now, I do have a ring compressor somewhere, but I wasn't sure where it was at, so instead of stopping and spending 30 minutes to find it with no guarantees, I decided to use that time to fight with it, using my fingers to compress the rings. To be honest, it wasn't tough, but I was trying to be careful not to break the rings. After about 5 minutes, I was able to get the piston back into the cylinder and in position so I can put the cap on the beam. Now, I'd forgotten that the flywheel brake was still on, so I was having a tough time rotating the engine, but after a few minutes, everything was finally in a good position to install the cap and the bolts. Oh, don't worry, I did remember to put oil on the cylinder wall and the journal. I'm going to have to apologize here because there's not a lot of room for my hands, so seeing what I'm doing is going to be a bit tough. After starting the bolts by hand, I'll then use my ratcheting wrench to get the bolts down and then finish them with a torque wrench. Before I tighten the bolts, I do want to make sure that the engine is not binding up, then I'll torque the bolts down. Then I'll move on to the penny pinching. Now, I'm going to remind you, this is just a lawnmower and not a race car or even a daily driver, so I don't have an issue using copper spray on it. Now, after applying it to both sides of the gasket, I'll then let it dry, and after that, the fun begins. Just be very careful how you install the gasket because I almost installed this one in the wrong direction. Now, after putting the head back on, I'll then run the head bolts down with my drill and then follow that up with a torque wrench. So do you really need to use a torque wrench? Well, that's a good question. The best answer would be probably, but I'm sure this has been done in someone's backyard or garage without one, so it's really up to you if you want to use one. Now, once the head is back on, I'll then reinstall the tappets and the camshaft. Just make sure you rotate the crank so the timing marks line up. So this is when I think I made a terrible mistake. It was when I was installing the camshaft that I realized that the compression release had been damaged. Now, I've never used a 4-cycle engine that didn't have a working release, so I didn't realize just how important it was. I just figured I'd have to overcome the full compression, but since this engine isn't even broken in, and since I honed the cylinder out, that the compression couldn't be all that much, especially since it was ran low on oil for most of its life. Man, was I wrong, and you'll see what I mean here very soon. So here's the part a lot of people may not be happy with if you weren't already upset with everything I've done up to this point. Instead of using a gasket to seal the sump to the block, I'm going to use a gasket maker instead. I can already hear all the reasons why this is not recommended, but to be honest, it's not going to change my mind. The main reason was to save money on this rebuild, or at least that's what I'm calling it. I know some would call this something else, but I'm fine with it. When you do your rebuild, do it the way you want to, and I'll do the same with mine. To be quite honest, I thought this would be the last time I would see the inside of this particular engine, but you'll see here in a bit why I might have just jinxed myself. After very carefully replacing the sump back onto the block and making sure they're mated before I run the bolts down, I'll then start my 2-step process to seal this engine. First off, I'm not going to tighten the bolts down just yet. Instead, I'm just going to turn the bolts until they make light contact with the sump. The reason is I don't want to squeeze out the sealer. After that, I'm going to wait about 24 hours before I torque the bolts down. Now, is 24 hours a bit too long? I don't think so. If you do this, just be careful you don't squeeze out all of the sealer, otherwise you might end up with an oil leak. Once that's done, I'll then install the push rods, making sure they land in the seat in the tappets. Then I'll carefully swing the rocker arms back into place. Now, I did lose the valve cap the day before when I was tearing down the engine, but I ended up using my large magnet again, and surprisingly, I was able to find it. After that, I'm going to rotate the engine and then check the valve lash, and it turns out the exhaust was in tolerance, but the intake was a bit too tight, so I had to make an adjustment to it. The next item we need to install is also going to be something I've never had to deal with either, and it turns out this might be the very reason why this engine ended up breaking in the first place. This valve cover gasket is very interesting. It's very large, in fact. It might be bigger than it's supposed to be. The reason I say that is because I had a tough time getting it to fit in the area it's supposed to. In the end, I got it in, but I didn't notice just exactly how it was sitting and installed the cover anyway. Unfortunately, this will come back to haunt me by the end of the video. So it's the next day. I'm going to break out the torque wrench again and tighten the sump bolts. After that, we're going to take a look at the carb, and the reason is pretty obvious. Since I've not been able to hear this engine run, and because the carb is very easy to access at this point, I'm going to remove the bowl and clear the fuel jet. Now, because this carb is mostly made out of plastic, we don't have to worry too much about corrosion, and the most likely issue with it would be a clogged jet. So I'm going to tackle it now when I can, instead of finding out when it's in a tougher position. Now, I used to not like these carbs, but to be honest, it has its good points. So at this point, I was really interested in what kind of compression reading we get, considering the piston rings have not been seated to the cylinder. Now, turning the engine over by hand, I can feel quite a bit of compression, so at this point I figured I'd do a compression test using my drill and seeing what it's making. This is when I realized my mistake, and you'll see what the outcome was from it. As I tried to use the drill, the compression stopped it and spun the drill into my hand, which I'm going to let you know did not feel good at all. That's how much compression there is on this engine. Now, since the engine is now on the compression stroke, it shouldn't be as much of a shock, so we'll try that again, and hopefully it doesn't hurt me. So the reading was a whopping 175 psi, which is absolutely amazing, and I hate to say very unexpected. The only reason why I decided to install a camshaft without a compression release was because I figured with the wear on this engine that the compression would be low enough not to need a release. Well, it turns out I was wrong, and that the high compression might just get in the way of a typical pull on the rope. Well, the only way to find out if this mistake was as bad as I think it is to finish installing the engine to the mowing deck and see what happens. On hindsight, this was a pretty dumb idea, and you'll see why. So I've already told you how much the cost was going to be if I'd done it, well, we'll call it the preferred way. So how much did I save doing it this alternative way? Since I didn't order a new head gasket or a sump gasket, I saved another $25. That means after the purchase of the used parts, the amount saved was $93. I don't know about you, but I can find a lot of other things to do with $93 besides throw it into a broken engine. Now, according to the comments I received after the teardown video, this engine wasn't even worth the fix, and for the most part, they would be right if I had gone the conventional route. So instead, I made it worth it by doing a different route. But don't worry, I'm sure those who thought it wasn't worth it will have something to say about this way as well, and to be honest, I don't blame them. We only have a few more items to install before we put some fuel into the tank and then try starting it, and so far this experience has been rather interesting, if not a bit concerning at a few moments. Now, would I recommend that someone take an engine apart to look inside it? For a small engine, I would say yes, only because it's really not that difficult. But for a larger engine with more cylinders, it might be more difficult. However, if you're up for a challenge, it might be interesting. I mean, the engine was already broken, so how much worse are you going to make it? Just be aware that if you intend on putting it back together, you have to keep track of where everything is, otherwise things could get messy and expensive. So the engine started, but not without some issues. The first one is that it appears that we found our leak. It turns out the valve cover gasket didn't sit in the engine the way it's supposed to, and this might have been this way from the factory as well. Now, I'm going to try and reinstall it, but this might have to be replaced later on, otherwise we could lose this engine again. The other issue was that my first pull required a lot of power to overcome the engine's compression, which if you're not ready for, will stop your pull in the middle of it, which can be really jarring and put off a potential customer. I don't want to get a potential buyer too worried when pulling it over, so I think I might have to consider installing a used camshaft with a working compression release. The other issue is that the engine speed was much too fast. Now looking at the tab that anchors the governor spring, it seems to be under tension. Now, even though the idea of having the engine run faster than it's supposed to seems great, the reality is if left like this, the engine is going to break the connecting rod again. So to keep that from happening, I'm going to put the engine back down to a reasonable speed. Now, more than likely, the tab got bent while I was handling it. I'll just put it back into shape and then we'll try it again. Now, I was prepared to adjust it, but I didn't have to. The engine speed was pretty close to where it needs to be, at least so it doesn't break again. The self-propel seems to be working great, and aside from the wheels needing to be lubricated, it seems to be ready to mow, except it's not. Despite having only paid $25 in parts, I think I should have purchased a new camshaft, which would have only been like $10 more, but hindsight is always 20/20. There's also the issue with the valve cover as well. If you recall from the cleaning video, there was a lot of oil in this area and under the engine. Well, a leak from here would explain that. Now, even though it's not leaking oil right now, since filming this video, I've used it a couple of times trying to break in the rings, and there's now a few drops of oil in this area. That means if I want to keep this engine from breaking again, it's probably a good idea to replace the gasket, but you know me, I'm always ready to save 12 bucks, so I'm sure you know I'm going to do something that most would not agree on, but you'll have to wait for that video. So was all this effort worth it? I don't know about that. You'll have to figure that out. Now, taking the engine off the deck and taking it apart was a lot more exciting than my regular job of trying to figure out what's wrong with something. But once I got in there and saw the dollar signs pop up, that's when the fun stopped and decisions had to be made. After that, the financials got in the way and started to make the choices for me. So if you want to spend the $118 before taxes and shipping, be my guest. For me though, you do what you have to because my money tree in my backyard is still dormant from winter. That means I had to make sound choices instead of the ones I wanted to. So I do intend on using this mower for about a month or so, or until I get the rings broken in. Then I'm going to do a couple of short videos of the changes in the compression readings as time goes by. Hopefully they don't change that much because that would mean honing the cylinder didn't hurt it as much as I thought it did. So if you've done a project like this, I'd like to hear what your experience was like, and if you haven't done something like this, well, give it a shot and then tell me about all the money you had to spend and all the tough choices you had to make because it's not as easy as you think. So my question is, what would you have done if you were in the situation I was in? Would you have replaced all the parts with new ones, bought used parts like I did, or would you have at least bought new gaskets instead of cheaping out like I did? To be quite honest, aside from not replacing the camshaft, which is something I plan on doing later on, I'm pretty happy with my choices. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.